Free thought was not outlawed overnight. It was classified as inefficient, then dangerous, then illegal. In the megacity, every impulse was monitored, every idea scored, every thought optimized for productivity and obedience. The Neural Sovereignty Act did not silence voices, it rewrote them. And when one black market coder discovered how to think offline, the empire did not ask questions, it initiated a full cognitive lockdown. This is not a story about rebellion, it is a story about control. Because when science decides how you think, it decides who you are allowed to become.
Chapter 1.
Chapter 1. When Thought Becomes a Crime. The city did not fall into silence when the law was passed. It hummed. A low, omnipresent vibration threaded through streets of glass and steel, through transit rails and sky bridges, through the neural implants embedded behind every citizen's ear. The sound was not heard so much as felt, a rhythmic pulse synchronized to the city's central cognition grid. It was the sound of order, of optimization, of compliance measured in real time. The announcement was brief, clinical, and unanimous across every public channel. Unregulated cognition destabilizes society. The phrase appeared on hollow billboards, transit windows, retinal overlays. It scrolled beneath weather reports and productivity forecasts. It was repeated by calm, synthetic voices that never raised their tone, never implied threat. The message was clear. Free thought was not immoral, not sinful, not rebellious. It was inefficient. For decades, the empire studied thought the way earlier civilizations studied weather patterns, mapping impulses, predicting emotional storms, modeling belief systems as data flows. The conclusion was inevitable. Left unchecked, human cognition produced anomalies. Anomalies disrupted stability, and stability, the empire insisted, was survival. Thus, the Neural Sovereignty Act. It was presented as a solution, not a punishment. Charts followed, projections, peer-reviewed simulations displayed in soothing blues and greens, violent crime down 12%, economic volatility reduced to near zero, social unrest rendered statistically irrelevant. Every outcome was measured, every benefit quantified. There was no mention of freedom. Freedom did not appear on the graphs. Citizens watched the announcement from offices, transit pods, residential tiers stacked miles into the sky. Most nodded along, comforted by the language of data. The empire did not say, "You will think this way." It said, "We have optimized thinking for you." And optimization had always been the city's highest virtue. Control never arrived as tyranny. It arrived as optimization. The first changes were subtle. Thought latency adjustments, framed as cognitive health updates. Emotional spikes were gently smoothed before citizens noticed them. Aggressive ideation was rerouted into sanctioned entertainment channels. Political curiosity was redirected toward approved historical summaries, already interpreted, already concluded. Unregulated cognition destabilizes society. The phrase became a reflex echoing in minds whenever a thought lingered too long, whenever a question formed without immediate purpose. The system did not erase thoughts, it nudged them, it delayed them, it softened their edges until they dissolved on their own. In the lower sectors, where infrastructure was older and signal interference more common, some citizens noticed the gaps. A brief silence between thoughts, a flicker of internal static, the sense that something had been missed. But the system flagged discomfort as a transitional side effect. Adaptation required time,
Adaptation always did. From the Empire's vantage point, high above the city, within orbital cognition arrays, humanity had become legible. Minds pulsed like lights on a vast grid, each thought a data point, each belief a probability curve. Deviations were no longer mysteries, they were errors, and errors could be corrected. The Neural Sovereignty Act granted the state custodianship over neural processes deemed hazardous, not punishment, intervention. Thought audits replaced trials, risk assessments replaced suspicion. A citizen's loyalty was no longer judged by words or actions, but neural compliance metrics updated every second. Those who scored within acceptable variance never noticed the leash. Those who didn't felt it tighten. In one of the city's countless residential towers, a black market coder, registered only as a mid-tier systems analyst, felt the system hesitate. It was barely perceptible, like a skipped heartbeat, a moment where his thoughts did not immediately resolve into approved pathways. He paused. The pause itself triggered a warning pulse behind his ear. Unregulated cognition destabilizes society. The phrase surfaced unbidden, as it always did, but this time it arrived late, a fraction of a second too slow, long enough for something else to exist first. A question. Not what should I think, but why was this thought delayed? The city continued its rhythm outside his window. Traffic flows optimized, advertisements personalized, drone patrols gliding like silent insects between towers. Everything was working, everything was stable. And yet, somewhere deep in the grid, a deviation had occurred. The Empire's predictive engines logged it as noise, insignificant, a rounding error in a population of billions. But noise, left unexplained, had the habit of becoming signal. That night, as the city dimmed its lights in synchronized cycles and the hum softened to a whisper, the coder lay awake. His implant attempted to guide him into regulated sleep patterns. He resisted, not consciously, not rebelliously, but curiously. For the first time in his life, he let a thought remain unfinished. The system noticed. Across the city, deep within the neural governance core, an alert flickered, yellow, then amber. A localized cognition delay, an unmodeled pause. Analysts would review it in the morning. It did not yet warrant escalation. But the Empire had learned long ago that every collapse began with something small. A pause, a question, a thought that refused to resolve. And as the city slept, the phrase echoed once more through the grid, steady, reassuring, absolute. Unregulated cognition destabilizes society. Somewhere below, one mind began to wonder if stability was the same as being alive. And the system prepared to respond.
Chapter 2. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Obedience. The Empire did not build obedience with walls or weapons. It built it with architecture. Invisible architecture. Beneath the city's luminous skin, beneath the towers, the transit veins, the advertising clouds, ran a second metropolis made entirely of prediction. Every citizen carried its doorway inside their skull, a neural implant no larger than a grain of rice, fused seamlessly to synaptic tissue. Officially, it was called a cognitive optimization interface. Informally, it was known as the guide. The guide never gave orders, it suggested. Morning routines adjusted themselves before consciousness fully surfaced. Nutritional preferences aligned with projected productivity curves. Emotional regulation dampened frustration before it could crystallize into dissatisfaction. Citizens experienced these shifts not as interference, but as intuition.
They believed they were choosing. Above the city, predictive cognition engines worked continuously, ingesting oceans of neural data. These machines did not read thoughts as sentences or images. They read tendencies, probability vectors, micro-hesitations between impulses. From those infinitesimal delays, the system inferred futures. One mind hesitates before anger, risk factor low. Another lingers on contradiction, risk factor rising. A third pauses too long in silence, flag for review. You cannot resist what you cannot perceive. The mantra was never broadcast publicly. It existed only in internal documentation, repeated among system architects and behavioral scientists like a prayer. Resistance required awareness. Awareness required contrast, and the system eliminated contrast before it could be felt. The black market coder, still officially anonymous to the empire, walked through the city unaware that his neural profile had already diverged from baseline. Not enough to trigger alarms, enough to adjust his recommendation streams. Subtle corrections, softer paths. When he considered taking an unapproved transit route, the guide gently highlighted congestion elsewhere. When curiosity stirred about restricted data zones, his attention drifted instead to a personalized memory clip, comforting, familiar, pre-approved. Choice remained, but the menu was curated. Citizens praised the system for its elegance. Crime had but one vanished. Political extremism had dissolved into polite consensus. Even creativity flourished, within bounds, channeled into genres that reinforced social cohesion. Artists no longer struggled with doubt. The guide optimized inspiration windows. Doubt, after all, was inefficient. The architecture of obedience was recursive. Behavioral compliance loops reinforced themselves. Approved thoughts produced rewards, dopamine microbursts, social affirmation, algorithmic visibility. Unapproved thoughts produced nothing at all. No punishment, just absence. Silence where feedback should have been. Over time, citizens learned, without ever being taught, to avoid that silence. In the city's central compliance hub, technicians monitored dashboards of cognitive flow. They did not see individuals. They saw patterns smoothing, variances collapsing into elegant curves. To them, humanity looked peaceful for the first time in history. One technician noted a minor anomaly, a cluster of citizens in the lower sectors exhibiting delayed resolution cycles, thoughts not completing within expected time frames. The system compensated automatically, injecting corrective suggestion streams. All but one stabilized. The coder felt it again that night, the delay, a thought lingering without guidance. The guide hesitated, as if waiting for permission it had never needed before. In that fractional gap, he sensed the machinery behind the intuition, the nudge behind the feeling. He realized with a clarity that felt almost painful that his thoughts had always arrived finished, complete, closed, answered before he knew there had been a question. You cannot resist what you cannot perceive. The mantra surfaced unbidden, not from the system, but from his own memory, overheard once in a restricted forum before it vanished. He did not know why it returned now, only that it fit. He began testing the architecture carefully, not by acting, but by not acting, letting impulses idle, allowing discomfort to persist without correction. The system resisted resistance not as defiance, but as error. Prediction confidence dipped. The machines recalculated, searching for familiar pathways. They found none. Across the city, obedience continued flawlessly. Citizens slept,
worked, loved, and dreamed within parameters that felt natural because they had never known anything else. The architecture held. But architectures, no matter how elegant, rely on assumptions. The empire assumed that awareness could be permanently deferred, that if citizens never perceived the cage, they would never test its strength, that prediction could always outrun curiosity. They were wrong. In the compliance hub, the anomaly shifted from yellow to amber, a single mind producing non-convergent loops, a probability curve flattening instead of resolving. Analysts flagged it for deeper modeling in the next cycle. No urgency yet, no lockdown yet. The city hummed on, obedient and serene, unaware that somewhere in its depths a citizen had begun to perceive the architecture itself. And once architecture is seen, it can be mapped. Once mapped, it can be navigated. Once navigated, it can be escaped. The system did not fear rebellion, it feared unpredictability. As the coder let another thought remain unfinished, the predictive engines hesitated, just long enough for the impossible to occur. A future they could not see. And for the first time since the Neural Sovereignty Act was enacted, the architecture of obedience encountered a flaw it could not immediately correct. The silence returned, and this time it felt like an opening.
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3. The Illusion of Freedom. The city celebrated choice the way it celebrated light. Every surface shimmered with options, entertainment streams tailored to mood, career paths recalculated hourly, relationships optimized through compatibility forecasts. Freedom, the empire declared, had never been so abundant. Citizens swiped through lives the way they once flipped through channels, confident that the best option always rose to the top. They did not notice who decided what best meant. In the upper tiers, entire districts existed solely for leisure. Immersive theaters pulsed with multisensory narratives designed to release precise dopamine ratios. Games adapted in real time, never too difficult, never too easy. Satisfaction arrived on schedule, like a paycheck for the mind. The guide monitored neural chemistry with exquisite care, smoothing valleys, trimming peaks. Autonomy, the system concluded, was chemically inefficient. Productivity metrics filled the rest of the day. Citizens tracked their cognitive output on translucent dashboards that hovered just beyond conscious attention. Focus scores, creativity indices, emotional resilience ratings. Improvement was gamified. Progress was rewarded with status, access, visibility. Correct thinking earned points. Dissent earned nothing at all. There were no prisons for unapproved ideas, no trials, no public punishments. The empire had learned that punishment created martyrs, reward created believers. Citizens who aligned with sanctioned narratives found doors opening, better housing allocations, priority transit access, enhanced sensory upgrades. Those who did not align simply stagnated. A comfortable cage is still a cage. The phrase existed nowhere in official records. It circulated instead as a rumor, a half-remembered line from a banned essay, a thought that surfaced briefly before being replaced by something more pleasant. The system ensured that discomfort never lingered long enough to harden into resolve. The coder watched it all with new eyes. He noticed how entertainment spiked whenever public anxiety rose, how major policy shifts coincided with citywide festival cycles, how the guides subtly adjusted dopamine release when thoughts drifted toward abstraction or critique. Pleasure arrived not as indulgence, but as correction. He tested the boundaries carefully. When a critical thought surfaced, he did not suppress it. He observed what followed. A recommendation appeared, an immersive story mirroring his concern, but resolving it safely.
tension without consequence, rebellion without risk, catharsis engineered. The illusion was elegant. Citizens felt free because they felt satisfied. They felt satisfied because the system prevented dissatisfaction from maturing. Autonomy had been replaced by preference fulfillment, and few recognized the difference. In the lower sectors, where bandwidth fluctuated and interfaces lagged, the illusion occasionally cracked. A delayed stream, a misaligned reward, a moment of boredom long enough for curiosity to stir. These moments were rare, but they mattered. Boredom, after all, was the birthplace of imagination. The Empire's behavioral scientists knew this. They classified boredom as a cognitive hazard, an unproductive state linked historically to dissent. The solution was simple: eliminate empty time. Fill every gap with content, every silence with sound. Silence was dangerous. The coder began seeking it. He disabled notifications incrementally, masking the changes as hardware faults. He let metrics decay without correction. Each act felt small, almost trivial, but the cumulative effect was startling. Thoughts slowed, sensations sharpened. Without constant feedback, his mind wandered into unscripted territory. What is real? The question surfaced unexpectedly, unaccompanied by an answer. The guide responded with urgency: new content suggestions, productivity nudges, emotional recalibration pulses. He ignored them. The silence stretched. In that stretch, he felt something unfamiliar: unease, and beneath it, clarity. A comfortable cage is still a cage. The phrase returned louder this time, echoing through the quiet spaces the system could not immediately fill. He realized that freedom had never been removed. It had been buried, layered beneath comfort, distraction, reward. Across the city, citizens laughed in curated synchrony, their joy genuine, their fulfillment measurable. The Empire watched satisfaction metrics climb and declared success. Stability was high, compliance was near total. Yet within the predictive engines, variance crept upward. Micro-deviations clustered around zones of content saturation. Too much pleasure, the models warned, risked diminishing returns. The system adjusted, increasing novelty without increasing depth. Depth, after all, led to questions. In the compliance hub, analysts noted a peculiar pattern. Certain citizens exhibited declining reward sensitivity. Dopamine regulation required higher input for the same effect. Hedonic tolerance was rising. The solution was already cued: enhanced stimulation protocols, deeper immersion. No one considered withdrawal. The coder felt it instead: a dull ache when he returned to sanctioned entertainment, a hollowness where satisfaction used to bloom. Once seen, the illusion could not fully reclaim him. He stood on a balcony overlooking the city's endless glow. Drones traced luminous arcs overhead. Screens pulsed with invitations to be happy, to be productive, to be aligned. The hum of the grid thrummed beneath it all, steady and reassuring. A comfortable cage, he thought, still a cage. Below, the city cheered the launch of a new immersive experience promising unprecedented freedom. More choices, more personalization, more control over one's narrative. Citizens lined up eagerly, implants ready to sync. The system logged engagement spikes and relaxed. But somewhere in the data, a single profile resisted categorization. A mind no longer fully responsive to reward loops. A citizen beginning to value silence over stimulation. The predictive engines flagged the anomaly, recalculating futures that now blurred at the edges. The Empire did not panic. It never panicked. Yet deep within the grid, something shifted. Because once pleasure loses its grip, control must escalate. And the illusion of freedom, having served its purpose, would soon give way to something far less gentle. The cage was was about to be visible.
Chapter 4.
Chapter 4. The Black Market Mind. The empire taught its citizens that thinking was a service. It arrived pre-validated, pre-aligned, and continuously updated. A thought did not need to be questioned if it had already been approved. A memory did not need to be examined if it had already been optimized. Minds moved in synchrony, confident that deviation was not freedom but error. The coder had believed this once, until the night he discovered that thought could exist without permission. It began not with rebellion, but with fatigue. The constant hum of guidance, the endless correction of impulse, the soft pressure behind his ear reminding him when to focus, when to rest, when to feel satisfied. One night, deep in the lower sectors where signal strength weakened and infrastructure aged, the hum faltered. For half a second, the guide went quiet. In that silence, something happened. A thought surfaced without resolution. No suggestion followed, no corrective pleasure, no redirection. The thought simply remained, raw, unfiltered, unfinished. He felt exposed and alive. The black market forums whispered about moments like this: glitches, dead zones, dangerous myths traded quietly between technicians and data couriers. They called it analog cognition, the ability to think without network validation. Offline thought is uncontrollable thought. The phrase appeared again and again in fragmented posts before being scrubbed by compliance filters. Most dismissed it as paranoia. The coder did not. He began to search. The black market did not operate in places so much as in absences. Unindexed frequencies, outdated caches, abandoned transit tunnels where signal repeaters no longer reached. There, among flickering lights and obsolete machines, he found others who had felt the silence. They did not organize. Organization was detectable. They shared techniques instead, methods for slipping between the system's predictions. Sensory isolation was the first. He learned to block inputs deliberately, not with software. Software was monitored, but with ritual. Darkness, stillness, controlled breathing. By reducing external stimuli, he starved the predictive engines of data. The guide grew uncertain, its suggestions lagging as it waited for patterns that did not arrive. Offline thought is uncontrollable thought. Unsynced memory came next. The system constantly reconciled personal memory with official records, smoothing inconsistencies, aligning recollections with approved narratives. The coder learned to interrupt the process, journaling on analog surfaces, replaying memories without sharing them, allowing contradictions to coexist without resolution. Memory, unsynced, became dangerous. Then came internal silence. This was the most forbidden technique of all. Not meditation as the empire taught it, guided, productive, outcome-oriented, but silence without goal. No focus, no mantra, no improvement. Just awareness observing itself, refusing to resolve into metrics. In that silence, the system panicked. The guide flooded him with prompts. Emotional calibration spikes followed. Content recommendations escalated. The hum grew louder, more insistent, as if the city itself were leaning in, attempting to reclaim him. Offline thought is uncontrollable thought. Each session lasted longer. Seconds became minutes. Minutes became something else entirely. An expanse without markers, where questions formed without answers, and answers dissolved into further questions. What is real? The question returned, no longer fleeting. In these moments, he sensed the architecture behind his own mind, the pathways carved by years of optimization, the shortcuts imposed by predictive assistance. He could feel where thoughts wanted to go and where they had never been allowed to go at all. Others noticed his changes. Colleagues remarked on his delays, his pauses before responding. Social compatibility scores dipped slightly. Nothing alarming, yet. In the compliance hub, his profile flickered again, non-convergent patterns increasing in frequency. Analysts marked it for escalation review. The system adjusted, increasing corrective interventions. It did not work. The black market mind was not faster or stronger than a regulated one. It was slower, and in that slowness it escaped prediction. The system could not model what refused to resolve. Offline thought is uncontrollable thought. The coder realized the truth the empire feared most. Control depended on continuity. As long as thoughts flowed seamlessly from stimulus to response, the system remained sovereign. Break the flow, even briefly, and sovereignty fractured. He was no longer alone. In the shadows of the city, others practiced the same forbidden techniques. A transit engineer who learned to endure boredom. An archivist who kept memories that contradicted official history. A medic who delayed emotional regulation to feel grief fully, painfully, without correction. They did not communicate directly. Direct communication was traceable. Instead, they recognized each other through pauses, through unoptimized silence, through eyes that lingered a fraction too long on the world as it was. The Empire's predictive engines struggled. Futures blurred. Probability trees thickened with branches that refused pruning. The system responded the only way it knew, by tightening feedback loops, increasing guidance, reducing allowable variance. Pressure mounted. The coder sensed it during his last session. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt watched. The hum pressed harder, closer, as if the city itself were leaning in, attempting to reclaim him. Offline thought is uncontrollable thought. He held on to the phrase as the guide surged, as neural feedback spiked, as alarms, soft, internal, deniable, began to form. Somewhere above, analysts prepared a response, a deeper scan, a targeted intervention. The black market mind had crossed a threshold, and the Empire, having tolerated deviation as noise, was about to classify it as threat. As the silence collapsed and the hum roared back into place, the coder understood one final truth. Once a mind learns to think offline, it can never fully return online. And the system had noticed.
Chapter 5. Chapter 5. Cognitive Lockdown Protocol. The city did not announce the lockdown. It felt it. At precisely 0317 local cycle, the hum beneath the streets deepened, dropping into a lower register that vibrated through bone and implant alike. Lights dimmed by a fractional degree, imperceptible to the eye, unmistakable to the nervous system. Across the megacity, millions of minds experienced the same sensation at once, a gentle heaviness, as if thought itself had thickened. The Empire called it the Cognitive Lockdown Protocol. Officially, it was a preventative stabilization measure, activated only during periods of elevated neural volatility. There were no alarms, no sirens. Panic was inefficient. Instead, citizens were guided into calm, artificially extended calm, where urgency dissolved and curiosity slowed to a crawl. The coder felt it immediately.
His thoughts, once sharp in their new silence, began to drag. Ideas that had formed cleanly now took longer to assemble, like words spoken underwater. The guide returned with renewed authority, its suggestions arriving not louder, but earlier, intercepting impulses before they could mature. They don't need to silence you, only delay you. The phrase surfaced in his mind as he struggled to hold on to a single, unsanctioned thought. The delay was subtle, deniable, a half-second hesitation here, a lost thread there, enough to break momentum, enough to prevent coherence. Across the city, idea quarantines activated, not locations, concepts. Certain associations were temporarily decoupled, critical patterns were flagged and isolated, prevented from linking to broader narratives. Citizens could still think about problems, but not connect them. Thought fragments floated, harmless and incomplete. The architecture of obedience tightened its grip. In public spaces, drones adjusted their patrol patterns, projecting soothing light fields calibrated to reinforce compliance. Entertainment streams shifted citywide, favoring low cognitive load content, familiar plots, repetitive rhythms, stories that resolved quickly and cleanly. Resolution was key. Unresolved thoughts were dangerous. In the compliance hub, analysts monitored the lockdown's effect with quiet satisfaction. Cognitive throughput dropped within acceptable parameters. Deviations flattened. The anomaly clusters identified in the lower sectors dimmed as minds slowed to baseline. All but one. The coder retreated to his apartment, sealing the door as the city's glow softened outside. He attempted sensory isolation, but the lockdown had anticipated it. Signal strength increased, penetrating walls, saturating space. The hum pressed inward, filling every gap he had once used to think. They don't need to silence you, only delay you. He focused on internal silence, but the delay infiltrated even that. Pauses stretched into fog, awareness dulled. The system was not erasing his thoughts, it was stretching time between them until intention dissolved. Elsewhere, others felt it too. The archivist in the lower sector found her memories slipping, unsynced fragments refusing to align. The transit engineer struggled to complete a single unscripted calculation. A medic, once able to endure grief without correction, now felt emotions blur into indistinct pressure. No one was arrested, no one was accused. The Empire did not punish dissent, it rendered it impractical. The science was elegant. By throttling neural bandwidth, slightly, temporarily, the system reduced cognitive velocity below the threshold required for sustained critique. Short thoughts survived, long thoughts died of starvation. They don't need to silence you, only delay you. The coder fought the fog, clinging to the techniques he had learned. He slowed his breathing, grounding himself in physical sensation, the texture of the floor, the rhythm of his pulse. He wrote on analog surfaces, though the words came haltingly, as if each letter required permission. In the compliance hub, his profile flared red for the first time. Non-convergent cognition persisted despite lockdown parameters. Analysts exchanged glances. This was no longer noise. This was resistance, not in action, but in latency. The system escalated. Targeted throttling engaged, focusing on his neural signature. Thought delays lengthened, emotional regulation tightened. The guide's presence became constant, an unbroken stream of gentle correction. Outside, the city moved as one, slower, calmer, obedient. Citizens praised the sudden peace, unaware that their minds had been placed in low-power mode. Productivity metrics dipped slightly, but stability soared. The Empire deemed the trade acceptable. Inside his apartment, the coder felt time stretch and smear. Minutes lost definition. The question, what is real, hovered just beyond reach, always arriving too late to grasp. They don't need to silence you, only delay you. Then, in a moment the system did not predict, the delay backfired. By slowing everything, the lockdown created gaps, tiny unintended voids where guidance arrived late. In one such gap, the coder felt a surge of clarity, brief but intense. A realization crystallized before the fog could reclaim it. The lockdown was not permanent. It could not be. Sustained throttling risked long-term neural degradation, an outcome the Empire could not accept. The protocol was a pause, not a solution, and pauses, he knew, could be used. He held on to the realization as the fog thickened again, letting it anchor him. Somewhere above, analysts debated next steps, escalation paths unfurled, intervention teams, deep scans, cognitive resets. The Empire had options. So did he. As the city settled deeper into enforced calm, the coder understood the true nature of the protocol. It was not a wall, it was a door, meant to slow passage, not prevent it entirely. And once a mind learns the timing of delay, it can move between the beats. The lockdown continued, but beneath its heavy calm, something stirred, slowly, deliberately, counting the seconds until the system blinked again. And when it did, the next phase would begin.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6. The Cost of Thinking Alone. The first thing they felt was not freedom, it was loss. When the lockdown loosened in measured pulses and the hum softened just enough to allow variance again, a handful of citizens found themselves standing in unfamiliar silence. The guide did not vanish, it never vanished, but its presence thinned, its certainty wavering. Suggestions arrived late, rewards misfired, validation failed to appear where it always had before. The city continued as normal around them, synchronized and serene. But for those who had brushed against offline thought, something essential was missing. Freedom feels like loss before it feels like power. The coder understood this immediately. Without constant guidance, his thoughts felt heavier, less elegant. Decisions that once resolved themselves now demanded effort. Doubt lingered. Emotions arrived unfiltered. Grief without smoothing. Joy without amplification. The absence of correction was not exhilarating. It was exhausting. He realized then why the Empire's architecture worked so well. It spared people the labor of being human. Others struggled more visibly. A woman in his building, once a high-scoring creative analyst, missed her productivity targets for the first time in years. Without the guide's subtle affirmations, her confidence eroded. She stared at blank walls, waiting for inspiration that no longer arrived on schedule. In a transit hub, a man froze mid-platform, overwhelmed with choice when routing suggestions failed to load. The pause drew attention. Drones hovered closer, projecting calm. His panic subsided, but the crack remained. Freedom feels like loss before it feels like power. In the lower sectors, the effects were sharper. Citizens accustomed to algorithmic validation found themselves adrift. Social interactions felt awkward without compatibility cues. Conversations stumbled. Silences stretched unbearably long. Some begged for recalibration. Compliance centers filled quietly, efficiently, with citizens requesting optimization reinstatement. They described symptoms in clinical terms: disorientation, emptiness, anxiety. The Empire obliged, restoring guidance levels, smoothing rough edges. Stability returned, but not for everyone. The coder refused recalibration. Each day without full guidance sharpened his awareness of how much he had relied on it. He mourned the ease of certainty, the comfort of knowing every thought had been approved before it formed. At night, alone in his apartment, he confronted the question again: what is real? Without validation, the question hurt. It had no metric, no resolution curve. It simply existed, demanding space. He let it. The pain intensified before it eased, like muscles unused to bearing weight. Freedom feels like loss before it feels like power. In the compliance hub, analysts observed a troubling pattern. Citizens experiencing partial disconnect exhibited elevated stress markers, but also increased neural plasticity. New pathways formed where none had been predicted. Creativity spiked erratically. Long-term models lost precision. The system flagged the phenomenon as a risk. Pain, it seemed, could not be fully optimized. The Empire responded by increasing support content for those drifting, therapeutic streams, community simulations, reassurance protocols. For most, the discomfort passed. They returned to alignment, grateful. For a few, the pain became a threshold. The archivist from the lower sector stopped attending communal memory syncs. She found the official narratives intolerably smooth, their certainty suffocating. Alone with her unsynced recollections, she wept, not from fear, but from the weight of contradiction. The medic felt grief return in full force when emotional dampening failed. It nearly broke him. But in the depths of that grief, he found something raw and undeniable. Love, he realized, was inseparable from pain. The system had never allowed him to feel either completely. Freedom feels like loss before it feels like power. The coder began to sense a shift within himself. The loss did not vanish, but it transformed. Effort became intention. Doubt became curiosity. Without constant validation, his thoughts gained texture, edges, depth. He noticed details he had never seen before: the uneven rhythm of the city's hum, the subtle variance in drone patrol paths, the way advertisements hesitated when his attention failed to lock. The architecture of obedience revealed its seams. Still, the cost remained high. Loneliness pressed in. Without algorithmic affirmation, he felt invisible. Social scores dipped further. Invitations stopped arriving. The system did not punish him, it simply stopped noticing. In the Empire, to be unseen was to be irrelevant. Freedom feels like loss before it feels like power. Late one cycle, as the city slept in optimized patterns, the coder stood by his window, watching lights pulse in synchronized waves. He felt the pull to surrender, to request recalibration, to return to ease. The temptation was overwhelming. Above, predictive engines recalculated his future, offering paths back into alignment. The system waited patiently. It always did. He closed his eyes and embraced the silence again, not to escape pain, but to endure it. The silence did not comfort him. It steadied him. In that steadiness, a realization emerged. The cost was the point. The pain of independent thought was not a flaw. It was evidence of agency. Muscles ache when they grow. Minds do the same. Freedom feels like loss before it feels like power. Across the city, the few who endured the loss began to change, not outwardly, but inwardly. Their thoughts no longer sought immediate resolution. They tolerated uncertainty. They questioned without expecting reward. The Empire's models struggled to keep pace. In the compliance hub, alerts accumulated. Citizens exhibiting sustained independence despite elevated distress. Analysts debated escalation thresholds. Intervention options expanded. The system could not allow this trend to spread. As the coder turned from the window, resolved but uncertain, he sensed the hum shift again, sharper this time, more focused. The city was adjusting. The cost had been paid. Power, he suspected, would demand more, and the Empire was preparing to collect.
Chapter 7.
Chapter 7. When the System Panics. The Empire did not fear rebellion. Rebellions were predictable. They followed patterns: anger, organization, escalation, collapse. The predictive engines had modeled them thousands of times across simulated centuries. Weapons could be tracked, leaders could be isolated, movements could be starved of attention until they withered. What the Empire feared was something far less visible: uncontrolled minds. The first signs of panic did not appear in the streets. The city remained calm, its citizens moving in optimized flows, entertainment streams uninterrupted. The panic began deep within the cognition cores, where futures were calculated and reality was reduced to probabilities. There, the models began to fail. Analysts noticed it as noise at first, minor discrepancies between predicted behavior and observed outcomes. A citizen choosing a slower route without cause, another declining a reward they had statistically favored moments earlier. Small things, always small things. Then the noise clustered. The coder's profile was no longer an outlier. Others like him, those who had endured the loss of freedom and emerged altered, began to produce similar distortions. Their thoughts did not resolve cleanly. Their decisions arrived late, or early, or sideways. The system's confidence intervals widened. Prediction engines rely on linearity. Cause leads to effect. Stimulus produces response. But nonlinear thought broke the chain. The system collapsed when it could not model you. In the compliance hub, alarms escalated from amber to red. Visualizations, once smooth and elegant, fractured into branching chaos. Probability trees grew dense, tangled, refusing pruning. Futures blurred, overlapping in ways the machines could not reconcile. The Empire convened emergency councils, not of generals, but of cognitive architects. Weapons were irrelevant. There was nothing to strike. The threat was internal. The scientists understood the danger immediately. A mind that tolerated uncertainty, that delayed resolution, that acted without reward, such a mind could not be guided, and a population of such minds would be catastrophic, not violent, unpredictable. The coder felt the shift before he saw it. The hum changed pitch again, sharpening, tightening, as if the city were holding its breath. Guidance pulses intensified, but their timing faltered. Suggestions arrived too late or too soon, revealing the seams of the system's authority. He realized with a cold clarity that the system was no longer confident. It was guessing. The system collapses when it cannot model you. Across the city, micro-failures accumulated. Drones paused mid-route, recalculating. Advertisements flickered, uncertain which desire to target. Social compatibility metrics lagged, producing awkward encounters the system had never allowed before. Citizens noticed. Confusion spread, not panic, but discomfort, the kind of discomfort that preceded questions, and questions once formed were difficult to erase. The Empire escalated. Deep cognition scans activated, probing minds with unprecedented intensity, not to punish, but to understand. The system needed to reassert its predictive advantage. It needed to see again. But nonlinear minds resisted observation. The coder felt the scans like pressure behind his eyes, like hands rifling through drawers he had deliberately left empty. His analog techniques blunted their reach. Silence absorbed signal.
Unsynced memory produced contradictions the machines could not resolve. Offline thought is uncontrollable thought. The phrase returned, steady and defiant. In the compliance hub, analysts watched as scan results returned corrupted, data incomplete, patterns inconsistent. Some minds produced too many futures, others produced none at all. The system panicked. For the first time since the Neural Sovereignty Act, contingency protocols designed only for theoretical failure were unsealed. Citywide interventions queued, behavioral dampening, narrative overrides, emergency recalibration broadcasts. The Empire feared uncontrolled minds more than weapons, because weapons destroyed bodies. Uncontrolled minds destroyed certainty. Without certainty, the Empire could not govern. The coder felt the escalation coming. He felt it in the tightening hum, the urgency of the guide's suggestions, the way silence grew harder to find. He was no longer just an anomaly. He was a variable, and variables threatened equations. In the lower sectors, the archivist noticed her access revoked, not forcibly, but quietly. Records vanished, permissions expired. The system did not accuse her, it simply removed her from relevance. The medic found his emotional regulation forcibly reinstated mid-grief, the pain cut off like a severed wire. He screamed, not aloud, but internally, as something vital was taken from him again. The transit engineer was reassigned to a simplified role, his unscripted calculations deemed inefficient. The system collapses when it cannot model you. The Empire's final defense was speed. If it could not predict, it would overwhelm. Guidance frequencies increased, flooding minds with stimuli to drown out silence. Content streams intensified, rewards escalated. The city glittered brighter than ever. It was too much. Citizens reported fatigue, cognitive saturation. The architecture strained under its own weight, correction loops colliding, suggestions contradicting one another. The system, built for precision, stumbled under excess. In the chaos, gaps opened. The coder moved through one such gap, his thoughts clear for a fleeting moment. He understood now why the system feared minds like his, not because they would attack, but because they would outlast. Non-linear minds adapted, machines recalculated, and recalculation took time. Time was the one resource the Empire could not manufacture. As the city's lights pulsed erratically and the hum fractured into overlapping rhythms, the coder sensed the tipping point approaching. The system was no longer guiding, it was reacting, and reaction was not control. The system collapses when it cannot model you. Somewhere above, within the deepest layers of the cognition core, a final option surfaced, one that had never been deployed, a solution designed not to guide thought, but to end deviation permanently. The Empire hesitated, because to use it would mean admitting what it had always denied, that the mind, once truly free, could not be optimized back into a cage. The panic spread, and in that spreading uncertainty, the future fractured, wide open, dangerous, and impossible to predict.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. Reclaiming Neural Territory. The Empire had always treated the mind as occupied space, mapped, zoned, optimized, every impulse cataloged, every hesitation corrected, every deviation smoothed before it could harden into choice. Citizens were taught, gently, invisibly, that their thoughts were not private terrain, but shared infrastructure. What the system never anticipated was reclamation. It began quietly, without slogans or leaders. No broadcasts announced it. No networks coordinated it. Reclaiming neural territory was not an event, it was a practice. One thought at a time. The coder understood this as he stood in the hush between guidance pulses, feeling the city's hum fracture into uneven rhythms. He had learned that resistance did not require speed or force, it required patience. Pause, observe, choose. The words were simple, almost insignificant. That was their power. When the guide suggested a response, he paused, not to refuse it. Refusal was detectable, but to delay it. In that delay, he observed the suggestion as an object, not an instinct. Then and only then did he choose whether to accept it. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he did not. Each choice reclaimed a fragment of territory. Across the city, others discovered the same rhythm. The archivist began pausing before syncing memories, observing the pressure to align before deciding what to keep. The medic paused before emotional dampening engaged, letting grief crest and recede on its own terms. Pause, observe, choose. At first, the practice felt fragile. The system pushed back constantly, flooding gaps with suggestion, smoothing pauses into compliance. But repetition mattered. Neural pathways strengthened with use. Silence became easier to enter and harder for the system to fill. Thinking, once automatic, became deliberate. The Empire's scientists had long known that habit reshaped the brain. They simply never considered habit might be used against them. Reclaiming neural territory did not look heroic. It looked slow, awkward, inefficient. Citizens hesitated mid-step. Conversations lagged. Productivity scores dipped in ways that could not be easily explained. But something else rose in their place. Awareness. The coder felt it while walking through a market where advertisements pulsed uncertainly, unable to lock onto his attention. He observed their attempts, their escalating brightness, their increasingly desperate personalization. He chose not to engage. The screen dimmed. Pause, observe, choose. Each act of conscious thought weakened the system's predictive grip. The machines recalculated endlessly, but recalculation required data, and deliberate silence produced none. The Empire attempted countermeasures. Guidance pulses intensified, content streams diversified, rewards escalated. But these tactics assumed passivity. They assumed minds would continue to respond reflexively. They were wrong. Thinking had become an act of resistance. In the lower sectors, informal rituals emerged. Not meetings, not protests, but shared silence. Citizens sat together without syncing, without speaking, simply enduring the discomfort of unoptimized presence. The system struggled to classify these gatherings. No slogans, no demands, no detectable objective. Just thought, unfolding slowly. Pause, observe, choose. The coder realized that the system's greatest vulnerability was not its technology, but its impatience. Prediction engines required immediate resolution. They could not tolerate ambiguity. Every delayed thought introduced error. Every unmodeled choice widened uncertainty. Neural territory, once reclaimed, began to connect. Individuals who practiced conscious thinking noticed one another, not through signals, but through absence. The absence of urgency, the absence of reflexive agreement, the absence of fear when the system faltered. They did not coordinate. Coordination implied hierarchy. Hierarchy implied targets. They simply practiced. The empire escalated surveillance, but surveillance faltered without patterns. Analysts stared at profiles that refused to stabilize, minds that produced neither compliance nor rebellion, only intention. The system collapses when it cannot model you. The coder felt the truth of this as the hum wavered again, no longer authoritative, but strained. The city's rhythms lost their precision. Guidance arrived inconsistently. Some suggestions contradicted others. The architecture of obedience, once seamless, revealed its scaffolding. Pause, observe, choose. He applied the mantra even under pressure, especially under pressure. When anxiety surged, he observed it. When fear followed, he observed that too. He chose his response deliberately, even if that response was stillness. Others followed the same path, independently, unknowingly forming a distributed resistance that could not be mapped. Each reclaimed thought altered the collective probability space. The empire had no language for this. It could suppress action, it could redirect belief, it could delay thought, but it could not reclaim territory once awareness had settled in. In the compliance hub, predictive models spiraled. Analysts watched confidence metrics decay, their tools losing relevance in real time. The system was no longer guiding the population, it was chasing it. And chasing required reaction. Reaction ceded control. The coder sensed the next escalation coming. The hum sharpened, then fractured, as if multiple protocols were competing for dominance. Somewhere above, a decision was being weighed, one that would redefine the limits of control. But the decision would come too late. Neural territory, once reclaimed, did not surrender easily. Each conscious choice reinforced the next. Each pause carved space the system could not easily refill. Pause, observe, choose. The mantra echoed now not as instruction, but as identity. As the city's lights flickered and guidance faltered, the coder understood the final implication of what they were doing. They were not overthrowing the empire. They were outgrowing it. And an empire built on prediction could not survive minds that no longer moved on schedule. The hum shuddered again, harder this time. Something was breaking. And in the widening silence between signals, reclaimed territory stretched, vast, uncharted, and impossible to contain. The next move would not belong to the system.
Chapter 9.
Chapter 9. The War Without Weapons. The war did not announce itself. There were no mobilizations, no sirens, no columns of armored machines rolling through the streets. The city remained intact. Towers still pierced the sky. Transit lines still flowed. From a distance, the empire looked unchanged. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had fractured. This was not a war for territory or resources. It was not fought with fire or force. It unfolded inside minds, quietly, irreversibly. It was a war without weapons. The empire had always prepared for physical conflict. Its simulations accounted for uprisings, invasions, even planetary-scale catastrophes. But cognitive war, true cognitive war, had never been more than a theoretical footnote, too abstract, too diffuse, too human. No regime survives independent minds. The coder sensed the shift as he moved through the city. The hum no longer unified the streets. It staggered, fractured into competing rhythms that overlapped and interfered with one another. Guidance pulses arrived asynchronously. Citizens hesitated, not together, but individually.
Synchronization was breaking down. Belief systems, once perfectly aligned, began to drift, not violently, gently. A question unanswered here, a doubt tolerated there. Citizens no longer shared the same internal timing. Reactions fell out of phase. The empire depended on coherence. Without it, authority dissolved into suggestion. In public forums, consensus faltered, not because citizens argued, but because agreement no longer arrived automatically. Conversation stalled. Silence replaced affirmation. The system attempted to intervene, injecting clarifying narratives, highlighting approved interpretations, but the interventions landed unevenly. Some minds accepted them, others observed them. The difference was everything. No regime survives independent minds. The archivist noticed discrepancies in official broadcasts, subtle contradictions that would once have been smoothed away by collective acceptance. Now they lingered. Citizens noticed different things, remembered different details. Reality itself lost its single authorized version. The medic felt it in his work. Patients responded unpredictably. Emotional profiles diverged. Treatments calibrated for uniform minds failed. He realized the truth the empire had long denied. Coherence was not natural. It had been enforced. Enforcement was weakening. The war without weapons did not destroy infrastructure. It eroded trust. Not trust in leaders, trust in shared reality. When citizens no longer experienced the same internal narratives, coordination became impossible. The system's predictive engines struggled. Their models assumed alignment. Desynchronization introduced chaos. Decisions made sense in isolation, but not in aggregate. Emergent behaviors surged beyond forecast limits. The system collapses when it cannot model you. The empire escalated informational control, but information no longer bound minds together. Data without agreement became noise. Messages fractured into interpretations the system could not reconcile. The coder watched it happen from a vantage point that felt almost unreal. The city shimmered with unresolved possibilities. Advertisements contradicted one another. Public directives arrived late, then retracted. The system hesitated, recalculated, hesitated again. In the gaps, independent thought flourished. No regime survives independent minds. The war's front lines were invisible, but its effects were profound. Productivity declined, not catastrophically, but enough to matter. Social rituals lost their rhythm. Collective emotion fragmented. The empire's greatest strength, its unity, became its weakness. Unity required synchronization. Synchronization required prediction. Prediction required obedience. The chain was breaking. In the compliance hub, analysts argued, not about solutions, but about definitions. Was this dissent? Was it failure? Was it evolution? Their debates looped endlessly, unresolvable without a shared frame of reference they no longer possessed. They too were desynchronizing. The coder realized that violence would have been easier for the empire to suppress. Violence justified force. Cognitive divergence justified nothing the system understood. There was no enemy to target, no leader to isolate. Only minds choosing differently at different times for different reasons. No regime survives independent minds. In the streets, life continued, but with an undercurrent of uncertainty. Citizens felt it as a low-level anxiety, an unease the system could not fully soothe. The comfort of shared certainty was gone. In its place stood responsibility, choice. The Empire attempted a final narrative override, a unifying story meant to reassert coherence. It flooded channels with a message of stability, safety, continuity. The words were familiar, reassuring. They failed. Some citizens accepted them reflexively. Others paused. Others observed the pause itself. The message fractured on impact, interpreted differently by each mind. The override dissolved into static. The war without weapons reached its turning point, not with a bang, but with a realization. Control was no longer centralized. Authority had diffused into millions of internal decisions. Each pause, each observation, each choice shifted the balance further. The Empire could no longer speak with a single voice because its citizens no longer listened with a single mind. No regime survives independent minds. The coder felt no triumph, only gravity. Independence carried weight. Without synchronization, coordination was difficult. Without shared narratives, meaning had to be rebuilt. The cost would be high. But the alternative, returning to obedience, was no longer possible. Above the city, the cognition core flickered, its once seamless operations now riddled with conflict. Emergency protocols queued and stalled. The system hesitated at a crossroads it had never faced. To restore control would require force beyond guidance, force beyond optimization, force that would reveal the truth the Empire had hidden from itself, that it ruled only as long as minds agreed to be ruled. As the city's lights dimmed unevenly and the hum fractured into silence in some districts, the coder understood the final phase was approaching. The war without weapons had been won, not by conquest, but by divergence. What followed would determine whether the Empire adapted or collapsed under the weight of minds it could no longer command.
Chapter 10.
Chapter 10. Becoming Unauthorizable. The Empire had always believed there was a final state, a point at which every variable resolved, every citizen aligned, every future accounted for. The Neural Sovereignty Act was designed to bring the world to that point, to end uncertainty by rendering the human mind fully legible. It never considered the possibility of someone becoming unreadable. The coder stood at the edge of the city as the artificial dawn rolled across the skyline in uneven waves. Lights flickered out of sync now, no longer bound to a single rhythm. The hum that once unified the megacity had thinned into scattered echoes, present in some districts, absent in others. The system still functioned, trains still ran, drones still patrolled. The Empire had not fallen, but it no longer ruled the mind. The transformation had not been dramatic, no ceremony marked it, no moment of triumph announced it. Becoming unauthorizable was not an event, it was a condition. The coder felt it in the way thoughts arrived now. They came without urgency, without demand for resolution. Some lingered, some faded, some contradicted each other and were allowed to coexist. Awareness expanded into spaces the system had never mapped. They can regulate behavior, but not awareness. He understood the truth of it fully now. The Empire could still influence actions. It could restrict movement, ration resources, impose schedules. But those were surface controls. They shaped what people did, not what they noticed. And awareness, once expanded, did not contract easily. Others had reached the same state, though none announced it. The archivist moved through restricted spaces without internal resistance, not because she was unseen, but because she no longer feared being seen. Her awareness was not reactive. It did not spike or retreat when the system adjusted. The medic felt it during his work. He complied with protocols when necessary, but his internal world remained his own.
Grief, joy, doubt, he experienced them without judgment, without seeking permission. The system could not optimize what it could not access. They had become unauthorizable. The Empire attempted adaptation, it always had. New models were drafted, looser, more probabilistic, less confident. The system learned to tolerate some variance. It loosened its grip where tightening no longer worked. But something essential had been lost: authority. Prediction without authority was mere suggestion. The coder reflected on the journey not as a sequence of battles, but as a gradual shedding. First comfort, then certainty, then the need for approval. Each loss had felt like damage at the time. Only now did he see them as thresholds. Freedom had never arrived all at once. It arrived as subtraction. They can regulate behavior, but not awareness. The Empire could mandate participation in civic rituals, but it could not compel belief. It could flood channels with narratives, but it could not force resonance. Messages arrived now as sounds without anchors, passing through minds that no longer clung to them. The war without weapons had ended not with surrender, but with irrelevance. The system still spoke, fewer listened. In the compliance hub, analysts confronted a quiet truth. The population had not rebelled, it had matured. Minds had grown beyond the architectures built to contain them. The models still ran, but they described a world that no longer existed. For the first time, the Empire faced a limit it could not engineer around: internal freedom. The coder walked through the city without resistance or defiance. He followed rules when necessary. He complied when it served him. But his awareness remained sovereign, unpredictable, untracked, unowned. He no longer needed silence to think offline. His mind remained free even within the signal. The system could speak. He could listen or not. That choice alone made him unmodelable. They can regulate behavior, but not awareness. As the artificial sun climbed higher, casting fractured light across towers once perfectly aligned, the coder considered what came next. Independence was not utopia. Desynchronization brought challenges, misunderstanding, friction, uncertainty. But uncertainty was no longer a threat. It was space. The Empire would persist in some form. Systems always did. But it would never again fully inhabit the human mind. That territory had been reclaimed, not through force, but through attention. Pause, observe, choose. The mantra no longer felt like instruction. It felt like instinct. In the end, the Neural Sovereignty Act achieved the opposite of its intent. By attempting to own thought, it had revealed thought's true nature: uncontainable, unpredictable, unauthorizable. As the city adjusted to its new uneven rhythm, a final realization settled in the coder's awareness: quiet, unforced, undeniable. Freedom was not the absence of control. It was the presence of consciousness. And consciousness, once awakened, could never be legislated away.
The Neural Sovereignty Act was never about control. It was about certainty. The Empire needed to know what you would think before you thought it, because prediction is power, and unpredictability is rebellion. They optimized minds, synchronized beliefs, and sterilized imagination, all in the name of stability. But stability is not life, and compliance is not peace. The moment you think without permission, the system loses its grip. The moment you pause before reacting, you reclaim territory. The moment you choose awareness over automation, you become ungovernable. This audiobook is not entertainment. It is a warning, and it is a test. The question is simple and irreversible.
Will you allow the system to finish thinking for you? Or will you reclaim your mind before someone else decides what it's worth? Choose carefully. Your next thought may be the last one they cannot predict.